Chapter 5 Psychoanalytic Criticism Introduction Para Psychoanalytic criticism is a form of literary criticism which uses some of the techniques of psychoanalysis in the interpretation of literature. Psychoanalysis itself is a form of therapy which aims to cure mental disorders, quote, by investigating the interaction of conscious and unconscious elements in the mind, unquote, as the concise Oxford Dictionary puts it. The classic method of doing this is to get the patient to talk freely in such a way that the repressed fears and conflict which are causing the problems are brought into the conscious mind and openly faced rather than remaining buried in the unconscious. This practice is based upon specific theories of how the mind, the instincts, and sexuality work. These theories were developed by the Austrian Sigmund Freud, Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939. There is a growing consensus today that the therapeutic value of the method is limited and that Freud's life work is seriously flawed by methodological irregularities. All the same, Freud remains a major cultural force and his impact on how we think about ourselves has been incalculable. Para. Freud's major ideas include those italicized in the next 3 paragraphs. All of Freud's work depends upon the notion of the unconscious, which is the part of the mind beyond consciousness, which nevertheless has a strong influence upon our actions. Freud was not the discoverer of the unconscious. His uniqueness lies in his attributing to it such a decisive role in our lives. Linked with this is the idea of repression, which is the forgetting or ignoring of unresolved conflicts, unadmitted desires, or traumatic past events, page 93, so that they are forced out of consciousness, awareness, and into the realm of the unconscious. A similar process is that of sublimation, whereby the repressed material is promoted into something grander or is disguised as something noble. For instance, sexual urges may be given sublimated expression in the form of intense religious experiences or longings. Later in his career, Freud suggested a 3-part rather than a 2-part model of the psyche, dividing it into the ego, the superego, and the id. These 3 levels of the personality roughly corresponding to, respectively, the consciousness, the conscience, and the unconscious. Para. Many of Freud's ideas concern aspects of sexuality. Infantile sexuality, for instance, is the notion that sexuality begins not at puberty with physical maturing, but in infancy, especially through the infant's relationship with the mother. Connected with this is the Oedipus complex, Oedipus complex, whereby, says Freud, the male infant conceives the desire to eliminate the father and become the sexual partner of the mother. Many forms of intergenerational conflict are seen by Freudians as having Oedipal overtones, such as professional rivalries, often viewed in Freudian terms as reproducing the competition between siblings for parental favor. As the very idea of the Oedipal complex would suggest, Freudian theory is often deeply masculinist in bias. Another key idea is that of the libido, libido, which is the energy drive associated with sexual desire. In classic Freudian theory, it has 3 stages of focus: the oral, the anal, and the phallic. The libido in the individual is part of a more generalized drive, which the later Freud called eros, E-R-O-S, the Greek word for love, which roughly means the life instinct, the opposite of which is thanatos, Thanatos, the Greek word for death, which roughly means the death instinct, a controversial notion, of course. Para. Several key terms concern what might be called psychic processes such as transference, the phenomenon whereby the patient under analysis redirects the emotions recalled in analysis towards the psychoanalyst. Thus, the antagonism or resentment felt towards a parental figure in the past might be reactivated but directed against the analyst. Another such mechanism is projection, when aspects of ourselves, usually negative ones, are not recognized as part of ourselves but are perceived in or attributed to another. Our own desires or antagonisms, for instance, may be, quote, disowned, unquote, in this way. Page 94. Both these might be seen as defense mechanism, that is, as psychic procedures for avoiding painful admissions or recognitions. Another such is the screen memory, which is a trivial or inconsequential memory whose function is to obliterate a more significant one. A well-known example of these mechanisms is the Freudian slip SLIP, which Freud himself called the parapraxis, PARAPRAXIS, whereby repressed material in the unconscious finds an outlet through such everyday phenomena as slip of tongue, slips of the tongue, slips of the pen, or unintended actions. Para. A final example of important Freudian terminology is the dream work, the process by which real events or desires are transformed into dream images. These include displacement, whereby one person or event is represented by another, which is in some way linked or associated with it, perhaps because of a similar sounding word or by some form of symbolic substitution, and condensation, whereby a number of people, events, or meanings are combined and represented by a single image in the dream. Thus, characters, motivation, and events are represented in dreams in a very literary way, involving the translation by the dream work of abstract ideas or feelings into concrete images. Dreams, just like literature, do not usually make explicit statements. Both tend to communicate obliquely or indirectly, avoiding direct or open statement and representing meanings through concrete embodiments of time, place, or person. Section How Freudian Interpretation Works. Para. Freudian interpretation is popularly thought to be a matter of attributing sexual connotations to objects, so that towers and ladders, for instance, are seen as phallic symbols. This kind of thing had become a joke even in Freud's own lifetime, and we should remember that he once said, quote, "Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar," unquote. Freud was a heavy cigar smoker, mind you, so he had a vested interest in saying that. In reality, Freudian interpretation is often highly ingenious rather than highly simplistic. For example, let's imagine how a dream featuring a Roman soldier might be interpreted. Freud believes that a dream in an escape hatch or safety valve through which repressed desires, fears, or memories seek an outlet into the conscious mind. The emotion in question is censored by the conscious mind and so has to enter the dream in disguise, like a person barred from a club, page 95, who gets in by dressing up as somebody else. The Roman soldier might be connected with the real subject of the dream by a chain of associations. Let's say that the dreamer is a young adult still under the thumb of an authoritarian father, but wanting to break away from his influence and experience adult life to the full. The Roman soldier might represent the father by a process of association. The father is associated with ideas of strictures, authority, and power in the domestic sphere. The Roman soldier is linked to the same things in the political sphere, so the one is substituted for the other. So the soldier in the dream is a symbolic representation of the father. Para. But several meanings might be condensed into this symbol. Suppose the dreamer is tempted to rebel against the father by entering into a sexual liaison of which the father would certainly disapprove. The Roman soldier might also represent this person, the envisaged lover. Perhaps the cliched phrase Latin lover might have prompted this. Thus, both the feared father and the desired lover are condensed into the single dream future of the Roman soldier. Para. The purpose of devices like displacement and condensation is twofold. Firstly, as we said, they disguise the repressed fears and wishes contained in the dream so that they can get past the censor which normally prevents their surfacing into the conscious mind. Secondly, they fashion this material into something which can be represented in a dream, that is, into images, symbols, and metaphors. Material has to be turned into this form for dreams, since dreams don't say things, they show things. In this sense, especially as we have indicated, they are very like literature. Hence the interest of literary criticism in Freudian methods of interpretation. Para. This should raise questions in your mind about how we decide when a Freudian interpretation is plausible and when not. I want to take one more example, this time from a book by Freud called The Psychopathology of Everyday Life. In spite of its title, this is one of Freud's most enjoyable and accessible publications. In subtitled explains what it's about. Quote, forgetting, comma, slips of the tongue, comma, bungled actions, comma, superstitions and errors, unquote. Bungled actions are when you do things like unwrapping a sweet, putting the paper in your mouth and throwing away the sweet. The underlying assumption is that when some wish, fear, memory or desire is difficult to face, we may try to cope with it by repressing it, that is, eliminating it from the conscious mind. Page 96. But this doesn't make it go away. It remains alive in the unconscious, like radioactive matter, buried beneath the ocean and constantly seeks a way back into the conscious mind, always succeeding eventually. As Freud famously said, there is always a return of the repressed. Slips of the tongue or pen, the forgetting of names and similar accidents show this repressed material in the act of seeking a way back. Para. The example is from Freud's own experience, and it attributes significance to the forgetting of a word from a quotation. It is worth spending a little time on, since it typifies the quality of complexity and ingenuity which I have suggested is common in Freudian interpretation. Freud explains that while on holiday with his family, he met an academic young man who, like Freud, was Jewish, and they discussed the anti-Semitism which might hinder their careers. The young man voiced strong feelings on this matter, expressing the wish that such wrongs might be put right by a future generation. He met this point with a quotation from the Latin poet Virgil, using words spoken by Dido, queen of Carthage, when she is abandoned by Aeneas, Aeneas. Her words are, quote, exoriare, exoriare, aliquis, aliquis, nostris, nostris, ex, ossibus, ossibus, altor, ultur, unquote, meaning, may someone arise from our bones as an avenger, unquote. But in quoting the line in Latin, the young man accidentally leaves out the word aliquis, which means someone. Freud corrects the quotation, and the young man, who has read Freud's books, challenges him to explain the significance of this simple act of forgetting. Freud accepts the challenge and asks the young man to say candidly and uncritically whatever comes into your mind if you direct your attention to the forgotten word without any definite aim. This produces the following sequence of associations. Para. Firstly, similar sounding words like relics, liquefying, fluidity, and fluid. Secondly, Saint Simon of Trent, whose relics he saw some years ago. Thirdly, an article in an Italian newspaper called What St. Augustine Says About Women. Fourthly, St. Januarius, Januarius, whose blood is kept in a phial in a church at Naples and on a particular holy days miraculously liquefies. He says the people get very agitated if it is delayed. Freud points out that two of the saints, Januarius and Augustine, have names which link them closely with the calendar, and he has already worked out, page 97, why the young man forgot the word aliquis. The young man has been uneasy about a certain event, and if he had said the word aliquis, that would have reminded him again of this anxiety. So the unconscious protects him by deleting the word from his conscious memory. Perhaps you can already work out what the event is which the young man is worried about. He breaks off and says in some embarrassment, I have suddenly thought of a young lady from whom I might easily hear a piece of news that would be very awkward for both of us, unquote. He hesitates and Freud asks, quote, that her periods have stopped, unquote. The young man is astonished and Freud explains how he knew, quote, think of the calendar saints, the blood that starts to flow on a particular day, the disturbance when the event fails to take place, unquote, stop. Section Stop and Think begins. Para. In its elaborateness and its use of what literary critics would call symbolism, this example is fairly typical of aspects of psychoanalytic interpretation. How convincing do you find it? Para. Try to pinpoint your own reaction in a specific way. What is your judgment based upon? Do you distrust the example because of its elaborateness? I am assuming some degree of distrust, since that is what I have encountered whenever I have used it. Should there be a limit to the number of associative steps allowable between the slip and its interpretation? Without some such limit, could not the chain of associations be made to stretch to almost any interpretive destination? Or is it the nature of the steps rather than their number which makes the example finally unconvincing? If so, what is it about them which has this effect? Para. Note that the example seems to require the unconscious to anticipate the flow of conscious thought, to see that any word suggesting liquid will act as a reminder of the feared pregnancy, and then to eliminate the Latin word aliquis preemptively from the conscious mind. Para. My own feeling about it is that there is an attractive complexity about this example, far removed from the banalities of interpretations which are popularly called Freudian. The anxiety, page 98, felt by the young man is shown to suffuse the mind in what seems to me a very plausible way, rather than being locked away in some specific compartment. Hence it is likely to surface anywhere at all. But perhaps this is simply to say that the elaborateness is what I like about this example. Stop and think section closes. Para. Freudian interpretation then has always been of considerable interest to literary critics. The basic reason again is that the unconscious, like the poem or novel or play, cannot speak directly and explicitly, but does so through images, symbols, emblems, and metaphors. Literature too is not involved with making direct, explicit statements about life, but with showing and expressing experience through imagery, symbolism, metaphor, and so on. However, because the statements made are not explicit, there is an inevitable judgmental element involved, and in consequence, psychoanalytic interpretations of literature are often controversial. Section Freud and Evidence. Para. Distrust of Freud has been growing in recent years, partly as a result of his mainly negative views on women as seen in the notion that women's sexuality is based upon feelings of narcissism, masochism, and passivity, and the idea that they suffer from an innate form of inferiority complex known as penis envy. Recent work seems to show that these views were maintained by misreading or even misrepresenting the evidence presented to him by his patients. For instance, by taking accounts of sexual abuse in childhood as fantasies rather than reality. Freud's willful misreading is seen in the case study, usually known simply as Dora, D-O-R-A, but officially entitled Fragment of an Analysis of a Case of Hysteria, Volume 8 in the Pelican Freud Library. Feminist critics and others have read this case study as a means of psychoanalyzing Freud. For instance, a collection of essays on the case appeared in 1985 under the title In Dora's Case, Freud, Hysteria and Feminism, edited by Charles Bernheimer and Claire Kahane, Virago, 1985. Dora was brought to Freud for treatment in the autumn of the year 1900 by her father as an 18-year-old. Her parents had found a note threatening suicide, which was the culmination of a period, page 99, of withdrawal and difficulty. Dora broke off the treatment before it reached any conclusion, so Freud calls the case Fragment of an Analysis of a Case of Hysteria. The bulk of the material is Freud's analysis and interpretation of two dreams which related to him in the course of the treatment, and will concentrate on one of these. The family situation at the time the analysis took place is that Dora's wealthy parents were unhappy in their marriage, but they had formed a close friendship with another couple, Mr. and Mrs. K. A sexual relationship developed between Dora's father and Mrs. K, which went on for several years. Mr. K knew of this, and all three adults seemed to have an unspoken agreement that in exchange, as it were, Dora should be made available to Mr. K. Mr. K made approaches to her on two occasions, the first in his office when she was 14. In a state of obvious excitement, he suddenly took hold of her and began to kiss her. She reacted with a violent feeling of disgust and ran out. Freud considered this reaction neurotic. In his view, this was surely just the situation to call up a distinct feeling of sexual excitement in a girl of 14, since Mr. K, as he explains in a footnote, was still quite young and of prepossessing appearance. Page 60. The second occasion happened when Dora was 16. She and Mr. K were walking together beside a lake, and he, quote, had the audacity to make a suggestion to her, unquote. She slapped his face and hurried away. Freud is puzzled by the brutal form of her refusal and again sees her reaction as neurotic. When Dora told her father about what had happened, he asked Mr. K for an explanation, but Mr. K denied that the incident had ever taken place. Her father believed him rather than Dora. Given these circumstances, Freud's view of the situation seems remarkably perverse. The first of the two dreams on which much of the analysis centers was a recurrent one, which first happened when they were staying in a house by the lake where Mr. K made his indecent proposal. Indent. A house was on fire. My father was standing beside my bed and woke me up. I dressed quickly. Mother wanted to stop and save her jewel case, but father said, quote, I refuse to let myself and my two children be burnt for the sake of your jewel case, unquote. We hurried downstairs, and as soon as I was outside, I woke up. The Pelican Freud Library, Volume 8, page 99, indent closes. Page 100. Freud comments, firstly, that the immediate trigger of the dream is that when they arrived at this small wooden house, her father said he was afraid of what would happen if there was a fire there. Secondly, in the afternoon, Dora had woken up from an afternoon nap on the sofa to find Mr. K standing over her. In the dream, the father and Mr. K are transposed. Thirdly, some years before she had heard her mother and father having a serious argument about jewels. Fourthly, Freud points out that the German word jewel case is a slang term for the female genitals. According to Freud, therefore, the dream expresses Dora's repressed wish to give Mr. K what he wants, that is, her jewel case. The fire represents her own repressed passion. The figure of Mr. K is transposed with that of the father to express the wish that her former Oedipal love for her father will protect her from the temptation to yield to Mr. K's advances. Freud sees in Dora's resentment of the relationship between her father and Mrs. K a residual trace of this Oedipus complex, a feeling that Mrs. K is her successful rival for her father's love. Against the combined male forces of her father, Mr. K, and Freud, it would seem that Dora has little chance, and the whole case study certainly shows Freud and psychoanalysis at their weakest. Parenthesis, psychoanalysis in relation to feminism is further discussed in Chapter 6 on feminism. Parenthesis closes. Section, what Freudian psychoanalytic critics do. 1. They give central importance in literary interpretation to the distinction between the conscious and the unconscious mind. They associate the literary work's overt content with the former and the covert content with the latter, privileging the latter as being what the work is really about and aiming to disentangle the two. 2. Hence, they pay close attention to unconscious motives and feelings, whether these be A, those of the author, or B, those of the characters depicted in the work. 3. They demonstrate the presence in the literary work of classic psychoanalytic symptoms, conditions or phases such as the oral, anal, and phallic stages of emotional and sexual development in infants. Page 101. 4. They make large-scale applications of psychoanalytic concepts to literary history in general. For example, Harold Bloom's book, The Anxiety of Influence, 1973, sees the struggle for identity by each generation of poets under the threat of the greatness of its predecessors as an enactment of the Oedipus complex. 5. They identify a psychic context for the literary work at the expense of social or historical context, privileging the individual psychodrama above the social drama of class conflict. The conflict between generations of siblings or between competing desires within the same individual looms much larger than conflict between social classes, for instance. Section, Freudian psychoanalytic criticism, examples. What kind of literary problem can Freudian psychoanalytic theories help with? Let's start with Shakespeare's Hamlet, an example which is so well known that it has become a cliché. The relevant items in the above list of what Freudian critics do are 1. Stressing the distinction between conscious and unconscious, 2. Uncovering the unconscious motives of characters, and 3. Seeing in the literary work an embodiment of classic psychoanalytic conditions. In the play, Hamlet's father is murdered by his own brother, Hamlet's uncle, who then marries Hamlet's mother. The ghost of Hamlet's father appears to Hamlet and tells him to avenge the murder by killing his uncle. There is no obvious difficulty about doing this, but Hamlet spends most of the play delaying and making excuses. Why? He is not particularly squeamish as he kills other people in the course of the play. Also, what the ghost reveals merely confirms suspicions. Hamlet had independently formed himself, and he gathers other external evidence that the ghost is telling him the truth. So why the delay? Critics have long debated the question without coming to any generally accepted conclusions. Psychoanalytic criticism offers a neat and simple solution. Hamlet cannot avenge this crime because he is guilty of wanting to commit the same crime himself. He has an Oedipus complex, that is, a repressed sexual desire for his own mother and a consequent wish to do away with his father. Thus, the uncle has merely done what Hamlet himself secretly wished to do. Page 102. Hence, the difficulty for him of being the avenger. This view of the play was first sketched out by Freud in The Interpretation of Dreams, 1900. As Freud summarizes the matter, Hamlet is unable to, indent, take vengeance on the man who did away with his father and took that father's place with his mother, the man who shows him the repressed wishes of his own childhood realized. Thus the loathing which should drive him on to revenge is placed in him by self-reproaches, by scruples of conscience which remind him that he himself is literally no better than the sinner he is to punish. Indent closes, Penguin Freud Library, Volume 4, page 367. Para. As evidence for this view of the play, the psychoanalytic critic points to the bedroom scene in which Hamlet shows an intense and unusual awareness of his mother's sexuality. Freud links the situation of Hamlet in the play to that of Shakespeare himself. Quote, "It can, of course, only be the poet's own mind which confronts us in Hamlet," unquote. He cites the view that it was written immediately after the death of Shakespeare's own father in 1601, quote, "while his childhood feelings about his father had been freshly revived," unquote, and he adds, quote, "It is known, too, that Shakespeare's own son, who died at an early age, bore the name of Hamlet, which is identical with Hamlet," page 368. All the same, it is Hamlet, the character in whom the Oedipal conflict is detected, not Shakespeare, the author. Here, then, is a famous problem in literature to which psychoanalysis can offer the basis of a solution. The sketch for an interpretation of the play put forward by Freud was later developed by his British colleague Ernest Jones in Hamlet and Oedipus, 1949. There is a famous sustained literary pastiche of the psychoanalytical autobiographical view of Hamlet in James Joyce's Ulysses, 1922. Para. Another example of a puzzling play with which the psychoanalytic critic can offer help in Harold Pinter's The Homecoming. This example illustrates the third item in the list of what psychoanalytic critics do, the classic Freudian condition embodied in the play being that of the mother fixation. The Homecoming centers on an East End of London all-male household consisting of an autocratic father and two grown-up sons. The mother has been dead for some years, but her memory is worshipped by the widower and her sons. There is a third son who has emigrated to America, where he is a college professor. Page 103. He comes back on a visit to his family, bringing his wife, this being the literal homecoming of the title. During the visit, the sons and the father have the idea of setting their brother's wife up as a prostitute in a Soho flat and living off the proceeds. Their brother agrees to this, and the wife accepts it calmly when it is put to her, having first extracted the best possible financial terms and made it clear that she will be in many ways the boss of this new household. Her husband goes back to America without her and to their 3 children, all boys. These events seem to be so bizarre that the play is often performed as a kind of surreal farce. Para. But again, the psychoanalytic critic is able to offer an explanation which makes some sense of them. In her article, Pinter's Freudian Homecoming, Essays in Criticism, July 1991, pages 189 to 207, M.W. Rowe, R-O-W-E, suggests that the underlying explanation is to be found in Freud's essay, quote, "the most prevalent form of degradation in erotic life," unquote. The all-male family shown in the play suffers from a classic condition known as a mother fixation, in which there is an exaggerated reverence for the mother. Such people are attracted only to women who resemble the mother, but because of this, the shadow of the incest taboo makes the expression of sexual feelings towards them difficult or impossible.